Hi everybody. So this presentation is to walk you guys through how to write a literary analysis essay. This is something that may seem pretty basic to some of you. It may be information that seems obvious, but I do want to make a very clear presentation that explains how do you write a strong literary analysis essay. So before you begin writing, the first thing you should really think about is why are you writing this argument? And I don't want you to think of essays as essay. I want you to think of an essay as an argument because that's exactly what it is. Everything that you write is essentially an argument. You are trying to make a point or make a claim or clearly state something that you believe. So you want to think about why are you writing this? Is it to respond to a work? Is it to interpret the work and explain how different elements of the work have different meanings? Or is it to evaluate the work? Is it to say, here's its strengths and weaknesses? So the first is really more of a personal view. The second is more of a critical lens. And the third is an evaluative statement. So generally, what you're doing in an argument is you're actually doing all three. You're kind of doing a combination of these elements, and that's usually what helps you create a very strong argument. Doing just one of the three generally is a much more simplistic argument. So I want you guys to think about that. And I also want you to think about your audience. So when you're writing, your audience is really important. So there's a couple things I need you to keep in mind when you're writing to a specific audience. Imagine that they have not read the story. They don't know what it is. They've not read anything. They don't know about the characters, the plot, the background, the historical or biographical context, none of it. So when you're explaining the story, you need to clearly state certain aspects of the story or the poem or whatever it might be for your audience as though they've never read it. Now, that doesn't mean you have to sit there and explain the plot and everything else, but if you're talking about a character, for example, say in Jane Austen, if you jump in and start talking about Mr. Darcy, you have to explain who he is. You have to explain the background. Why does it matter that he's wealthy in this, Elizabethan society? Why is that important? So you could think about sort of explaining all this to your audience kind of at the start of your essay. But as you're writing, I want you to make sure you're clarifying certain statements for them. So you also want to think about how your audience could be favorable, neutral, or resistant to your argument. You don't know where they lie on that spectrum, so you have to approach all these viewpoints very carefully. Your job is to convince them of your stance about this text. So if, for example, say I was writing about Poe, Edgar Allan Poe, say I did Telltale Heart, and I was trying to convince my audience that the main character is schizophrenic. I would have to imagine that my audience may or may not be receptive to that idea, and I need to approach both sides very carefully. I can't just assume that they agree with me or assume that they disagree with me, because that would mean I would write my argument very differently. Remember that your audience may not necessarily be literary scholars, so you need to use very specific literary terminology in relation to the analysis. So things like metaphors, simile, theme, symbol, conflict. You need to be using these terms. That's how you demonstrate your expertise as the author. Your argument also needs to be clearly and logically organized for your audience to follow your train of thought. If it's chaotic and you're jumping from point to point and you don't have an argumentative structure, then they can't follow your argument and they're not going to buy it or believe it. And remember, that's your job. And remember that your audience is not your professor, so don't write to the professor. Try to expand beyond that. Think beyond just writing to one person. How much you write this to a more general audience, and keep that in mind as you write. So you want to make sure that you follow the argumentative structure. And again, this might be pretty rote and mechanical for you, but you do need to have an introduction, which it introduces the author and the text. You need to use a hook to get the audience's attention. You need to have an argumentative thesis statement with main ideas. In the body, you need to have clear main ideas organized into paragraphs. You need to have topic sentences at the start of your paragraphs, which clarify or convey what that main idea is. And you need to include specific evidence from the text and outside sources if you use them. And evidence comes in the form of quotes, which show or prove what you were talking about. You can't just tell me that in the yellow wallpaper, the wallpaper symbolizes her insanity. Yes, that's a clear statement, but then you need to show me a quote, which is her talking about the wallpaper and how she's trying to get out and how the person inside of it is her. That shows me her insanity symbolized in the wallpaper. And then make sure that your voice is the strongest in your analysis. So a lot of times students can go too far the other direction where they have too much evidence. So they just pull quote after quote after quote and they stack the quotes back to back to back. That's not analysis either, because then you're letting your sources make your argument for you. Instead, you need to have a nice balance between quotes from your sources and your own voice and analysis. The conclusion needs to wrap up with a sense of finality. You need to make sure that it's not too short. A lot of times people just tack that on in the end as a couple sentences. That's not a conclusion. And it needs to restate your thesis and your main idea in new words. So again, your intro and your thesis. The intro should have a hook, which is a way to grab your reader. You don't want to just dive straight in and say, I think this story is about X, Y, and Z. You first need to introduce the idea of the story. You need to clearly state your argument as a thesis statement. And a thesis is a claim that makes a unique argument about the text in relation to specific literary concepts. It is not a vague statement or just a recap of the plot. And you do need to have the main ideas that you'll be discussing in your thesis statement. Now, a thesis does not need to be just one sentence. It can be a couple of sentences. That's fine, as long as you get these elements in there. So I've given you some examples here of what is not a thesis. So the first one says Harry Potter and the Order of Phoenix is about Harry growing up and learning how to fight Voldemort. Is that true? Yes. Is it a vague recap of the plot? Yes. Has no argumentative claim and no main ideas. If you said Harry Potter and the Order of Phoenix is an amazing tale woven by an incredible author that talks about learning to be a wizard, again, it's a vague statement that does not make an argument. And a lot of times what people will do is put these fluff words in there, like amazing and incredible and fantastic and innovative. All of these things are true, but they don't necessarily make an argument about the text. A lot of times they're just filler. You don't want to do that. You want to be as specific, concrete, and narrow as possible in your thesis statement. And then Harry Potter and the Order of Phoenix is a really great story that includes lots of literary elements and was a beautiful narrative read. This is a personal opinion statement, and yes, you have the idea of literary elements in there, but it's not clearly stating what those elements are. So again, you need specificity in your thesis statement. So these are examples of what might be considered a better thesis. So if you said Harry Potter and the Order of Phoenix focuses on the coming-of-age journey typical of teenagers, focusing on the emotional conflict of man versus self with carefully constructed social relationships representing problematic social norms. This is much better because it has a clear argument. It focuses on the coming-of-age journey, and it has the emotional conflict, which is a literary terminology, man versus self, and it talks about the larger social norms and constructs that are being analyzed in the text. That is a strong thesis statement. Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix continues the idea of otherness found in the previous 4 books. The trinity between the friends is shattered as a symbolic representation of the treatise of adulthood on childhood innocence. Again, we have a multi-sentence statement. It brings in literary terminology. The idea of otherness is a theme. And it talks about a larger issue or message that the writer here is going to make a statement about. And then the last one says, Harry Potter uses the imagery of the phoenix to represent the rising of community against the splintering effects of division after tragedy. Short and sweet and simple, but it still conveys literary terminology, a clear argument, and main ideas. Okay, so I'm giving you guys an example essay here, and you can pause to look and read this. But basically, this is a good, solid introduction. So this is about the yellow wallpaper. This is a real student essay, so this is not perfect. As you can see, she didn't put the title in quotes as she should. Her title itself is not very creative, but it does a good job of conveying these specific elements. So the opening has an introduction, which not only introduces the text and author, but is a hook that gets your audience's attention. And then, if you look down, you'll see the background of the text or the historical situation for those who may not have read the story. So she talks about the story, talking about the rescuer and how it showed, tried to treat depression, just like the narrator. Then at the bottom, you see the thesis statement. It says, through vivid imagery, carefully constructed dialogue, and symbolism of the wallpaper, the story is a clear representation of the mental and creative oppression that many women faced during this period. So that has clear main ideas, vivid imagery, constructed dialogue, and symbolism. And it has an argument. The story is a clear representation of the mental and creative oppression many women faced during this period. That is a clear thesis statement. The body paragraphs, I'm giving you just an example here. But the first sentence is a clear topic sentence that conveys the main idea of this paragraph. And it says, the narrator's husband, John, portrays the patriarchal society and medical community all in one character. That's a clear thesis statement, or a main idea statement. Below that, you'll find different kinds of evidence. So you see where she says that the quote specifically from the text, where the main character says, John says, if I don't pick up faster, he'll send me to Weir Mitchell in the fall, blah, blah, blah. I don't want to go there. And then you see secondarily, if you go down to the next arrow, you'll see that there's a quote from an outside source, which actually was a letter written by Gilman. And she says X, Y, and Z. So this person has included that outside evidence as well. And then you'll see the analysis from the writer interspersed where she says, and I only pointed out one point of it, but the yellow wallpaper was written shortly after Charlotte, blah, blah, blah. It represented and portrayed these issues in this work. The rest here is problematic because it did X, Y, and Z. All of this is her analysis and her voice. And that's why I really want you guys to see this too. Is she has these really great examples of a very strong voice where she's making clear argumentative statements around the text. And then the evidence is quotes used to support that analysis. And then lastly, her conclusion, as you can see, is a nice, solid conclusion. It wraps it up with a sense of finality. It makes it clear to the audience that you're wrapping up your argument. It offers the clear final statement in a paragraph that is long enough, and it restates the thesis and the main ideas at the bottom there. So as you're going through the writing process, there's a couple of steps I want to make sure that you're kind of doing. As you're working through ideation, you can do it a number of ways. There's free writing, there's annotating, there's graphic organizers. I always suggest creating an outline. It helps me. Not everybody writes with one. You can analyze sort of the basic structure that you want to use, the clear main ideas, the key quotes you want to pull, and the points of analysis that you want to make. And then when you write, start with what's most clear or most pressing to you. You don't have to go in order. You don't have to start at the top and work your way down. You could start with the main idea and then at the very end go back and add your thesis statement because it's suddenly become clear what you're writing about. You can always go back and add or edit or change. Just get something down. And then revising and editing, don't forget to do this. Review the text once you've written the draft to see where there are logical holes or gaps that you could fill in. See where you can add details, evidence in the form of quotes, or strengthen your own voice. And then edit carefully for grammar, typos, punctuations, citations, MLA, and everything else. Because if those things are present, it undercuts your strength and your credibility as an author. So make sure that none of that is in there. Final notes, make sure that your document when you submit it is clean and free of errors. Make sure you have an MLA style bib if necessary. If you're not sure of how to do a bib, great resources online include easybib.com or Purdue OWL, highly recommend. And then make sure your argument is clear, neat, and easy to follow. So if you guys have questions about this, let me know. Otherwise, go ahead and move on.